Why are we not taught how to revise? Most of us spend over 6 hours at school every single day, and all of this content's kind of thrown at us and we're expected to remember it, but no one explains to us how we're supposed to do that. Luckily for you, I've tried nearly every revision technique there is, so today I'll be going through all of them and telling you which ones I would say are definitely worth giving a go, and others that I think are a complete waste of time. Hey guys, welcome back to my channel. In today's video we are going to be talking about the best ways to study effectively so that you can study smarter and not harder and make the most out of your time. If you're new here, hi, my name's Ellen. I'm a year 12 student here in the UK, so I sat my GCSEs last year and I'm going to be sitting my A-levels next year. I recently posted a video which was what I wish I knew before GCSEs, and considering my channel's still fairly new, that did so much better than I expected. And I put a poll out on my community tab asking if you wanted a separate video with revision techniques, and the majority of people said that they did. So with A-levels and GCSEs right around the corner, I know a lot of you are going to be starting to revise, and if you aren't, take this as your sign to get the ball rolling. But I've always been quite academic myself, which is probably why my watch history on YouTube, it's all lifestyle and productivity videos, which is ironic considering that's what I post as well. So I've watched my fair share of study advice videos, so I'm going to use my knowledge to make sure that by the end of this video you feel a bit more confident about how you can revise going forward. I also think it's really important to make sure that you remember that revision's really subjective. Different people learn in different ways, so how you revise is going to be different to how your friend revises and vice versa. I think it's important that you just try lots of different techniques and then decide which ones work best for you, and make sure that you use more than one as well. You don't have to just stick to flashcards or just stick to mind maps. I think using a variety of different techniques is important because you keep your brain engaged, and also it's just less boring then. Before we get on to the actual revision techniques, there's just two things I want to briefly go over before we start. The first is sort of how I view the overall process of learning a new concept. Certain revision techniques are good for certain stages of the learning process. What I mean by that is when you're initially taught something, that's like the learning process. So that typically happens in the classroom when you're initially introduced to a concept or idea. And then after learning, you've got the understanding. This is sort of what you do when you do homework. That's just making sure that you can wrap your head around what you've done in the lesson. And then you've got memorizing, which is the final stage, and that's what revision should be. It's definitely important to differentiate between the different stages because lots of people jump straight from the lesson to revision and think that they've just got to memorize what they've been told in the lesson. But more often than not understanding the content, which is what you need to do in between, is the difference between getting good grades and not getting good grades. Because a lot of questions are application questions. So yeah, you can memorize definitions, but if you don't actually understand what you're talking about, it makes it a lot harder to answer certain questions. And also, I feel like it's just so much easier to memorize something if you actually understand it. And the second thing I want to quickly talk about is the difference between active and passive revision techniques. You've probably heard people talk about this already, but passive revision techniques are things that don't really require much energy. They don't really challenge you. They're sort of useless, to be honest. Whereas active revision techniques involve actively recalling information from your long-term memory. It requires more effort because you actually have to use your brain, but it's much more beneficial and a better use of your time, and a good way for you to test yourself and see where you have gaps in your knowledge. Okay, now we can move on to the actual revision techniques. Make sure you stay to the end of this video as well, because my final point is what I think is the most important thing when it comes to getting good grades. Okay, number one is highlighting. When people don't know how to revise, the most common things that they do is read over their notes and highlight. And whilst it can be useful to sort of just skim over the material and familiarize yourself with the content, highlighting is a passive revision technique, and for the most part it is a waste of time. As an initial step before, say, making notes, like highlighting just the key points for later on, that can be useful, but it's definitely not something to be relying on because you can't remember something just from highlighting it. This is the same thing as just rereading notes or rereading the textbook that isn't going to work unless you just reread the exact same sentence over and over and over and over again, but that's not really helping you either. Lots of people tend to do things like highlighting and rereading because it's easy, it doesn't require much effort, and they can convince themselves that they're actually doing something, but it's not that helpful for you, it's just a waste of time. You may as well be watching Netflix, let's be honest. It's not going to help you. Okay, now moving on to flashcards. We've gone from pretty much the worst to the best revision technique, I think. Flashcards can be so useful for remembering information as long as they're used correctly. I've seen some photos of people writing flashcards where they literally just copy out the textbook onto a card, which is essentially just writing notes, but on a flashcard rather than a piece of paper. If you do it like that, it is pretty much a waste of time because you aren't using active recall. Flashcards work best when they're like cue cards, so you have a question on one side and the answer on the other, or like the definition and the key term on either side. That way you can test yourself. If you do think you'll be tempted to like look at the answer, you can get other people to use the cards as well. But it's a great way to integrate both active recall and spaced repetition into your revision. Something I would definitely recommend, which I did use towards the end of GCSEs, and I'm hoping to set up for my A-levels as well, is the Leitner System. Essentially what it is separating your flashcards into different boxes based on how well you answer them. So the first box is going to be flashcards that you go over every single day. The second box is going to be flashcards that you go over every second day. The third might be once or twice a week, the fourth once a fortnight, etc. And all of your flashcards will start in the first box, and every time you get them right, you'll move them to the next box, and then the next box. But if you get a flashcard wrong, you have to move it right back to the very start. The point of this is to make sure you aren't going over the flashcards that you already know inside out over and over again, and you're prioritizing the ones that you really don't know. Now you can either do this like physically with different boxes, that's what I do, I have like little trays that I put the flashcards in, or you could do it using online resources, so I know that Anki and Quizlet are both really good for digital flashcards. I also have a friend that uses Study Smarter for her flashcards. I personally haven't used it, but she says it's good, so that's something you could check out as well. But flashcards can be so useful if used correctly, and I know that they can be time consuming, but if you do it as you go along, so for instance after the lesson you make flashcards on what you learned, by the time it comes to actually revising the content you'll have all of them pre-made. But if it is a little bit close to GCSEs and you find yourself sort of cramming, just write flashcards on the key information. And you can use some of the techniques which I'm going to be talking about later on to identify which topics you're weaker in and then make flashcards on those. I don't recommend cramming, but let's be honest, we've all done it at some point, and the best thing you can do is just make sure that it's effective cramming, and flashcards are the best way I think for memorizing definitions, key information, that sort of thing. Okay, next we move on to the very controversial making notes. Personally, I love making notes. I always have done, and I know if I'm 100% honest with myself, they probably aren't the most effective revision method. It's quite passive, you're not really testing yourself, but I think it's a really key stage in understanding. At the start, when I spoke about learning, understanding, memorizing, it comes in the understanding part. A lot of people will just rely on the notes that they make in lessons, and whilst that's all good and well for some people, personally for me, I prefer to rewrite my notes when I get home using lots of different resources. That's how I like to do it. I think that works best for me to just kind of consolidate it all in one place, and I can condense everything down into just like one page of notes. But it can be quite time consuming, so if you don't find that it benefits you, I would just kind of skip that step. Especially if you're short on time, just rely on your class notes if you can, if you are cramming. The two key things to keep in mind when it comes to making notes is number one, the specification is your best friend. If you don't know what the specification is, it's just essentially a list of all the topics and the content that could come up. So if you use the specification when making your notes, you can make sure that you've gone over all of the points. And then you won't be revising any unnecessary stuff as well. Sometimes teachers tell you things that you don't actually need to know. So that way you're not going to be memorizing facts that you don't need to. Also, whatever you do, please do not just copy out the textbook word for word. I'm guilty of it. I used to do that all the time. But if you write things in your own words, you're much more likely to remember it. Of course, there are certain things, like for instance for law, I have to make sure that I write something word for word to get the marks. But for the most part, when you're just trying to wrap your head around a concept, writing it word for word is just a waste of time. That's the thing, for a lot of these, they can be really useful, but you have to do it in the right way. Flashcards are much more useful if it's a question and an answer, and notes are much more useful if it's a condensed version of the textbook in your own words. Similar to notes, the next thing is topic summaries. So just taking one big topic and consolidating it into maybe half a page of notes. The best part about this is it allows you to just pick out the key points. And I would also recommend sticking them to your wall so you have like all of the main topics laid out and just the main points that you need to go over. When you get to a point where you're fairly comfortable with all of the content, there's no point constantly going over like 5 pages of one topic. If you can get it down to 3/4 of a page, just a couple of bullet points even, the main points that you either keep forgetting or you're not as comfortable with, or the main things that you need to know for that topic, then you can put that up somewhere in your room so you can constantly look at it. And that way you can be reminded of the majority of that content in that topic. Okay, next is online resources. This is quite broad, lots of things could come under this. Personally for me, the main ones are Uplearn and Seneca. Uplearn you do have to pay for. The only reason I'm mentioning it is because my school gives the students that take those specific subjects access to it. But Seneca is one of my all-time favourite websites. If you don't know what Seneca is, it's essentially just a website with lots of different resources for the different topics for both A-level and GCSE subjects. It gives you lots of practice questions, different videos, quizzes, that sort of thing. It almost feels a bit like a game, like it's a really interactive kind of way of learning something. I quite like it. It's not for everyone. I know lots of people that don't like using things like Uplearn, but for me, I find that it just makes revision a little bit more interesting. Like looking at a book all day can get kind of boring, so I think doing something like Seneca just breaks it up a little bit. Okay, next we move on to Blurting. I owe so many of my good grades to Blurting. I don't know, it's the best way I think to revise. If you don't know what blurting is, it's when you write a topic in the middle of the page and then without using any of your resources you write down everything you can remember about that topic. Then you compare what you wrote to either your notes or the textbook and you fill in any of the gaps with a different coloured pen. The reason this is so effective is it allows you to identify like the weaker areas or the gaps in your knowledge. And of course, brain dumping doesn't help you necessarily remember anything, it just allows you to see which areas you need to prioritise and put more time into. And if you do it regularly, then you'll constantly be reminded of the areas that you need to go over and the ones that you know quite well and don't need to go over as often. On the topic of prioritising, I also think it's useful to have like a RAG spreadsheet. RAG is just red, amber, green, so you colour code all of the topics for your subjects. The red if you really don't know them, green if you definitely do, and amber if you're sort of just in between. This is a key part of working smarter, not harder. There's no point you spending hours going over something that you're already familiar with. And I know it feels good because you're like, oh yes, I know this, so you want to keep going over it. But having a red, amber, green spreadsheet allows you to hold yourself accountable. You have to be honest with yourself with what topics actually need your attention and which ones don't. Next is watching videos. For some people, this is how they revise. There are so many YouTube channels that do like GCSE and A-level videos. Free science lessons was the one that I used the most for GCSEs. And for a lot of people, that is their main way of understanding something new. And whilst it is good for like grasping and understanding of a concept, I think for a lot of people it does just go in one ear and out the other. If you're confused on a topic, by all means watch a video to wrap your head around it. If you watch a video and then make flashcards on it, great. But watching videos just on their own probably isn't the most useful way of revising. But hey, that's just down to personal preference. Some people don't watch videos at all. Personally, I like them if I'm a little stuck on something, just to hear someone else explain it. Sometimes that's all you need, someone else explaining it to you verbally, and then it clicks. And that could also be you talking, which is why the next thing is teaching others. As I was saying at the start, the main thing is understanding the concept. And the best way to make sure you understand it is explaining it to someone else. If you don't have the privilege of someone who's happy to sit there and listen to you talking about all sorts of things, you can literally just talk to a wall. It might feel a little bit weird. I talk to inanimate objects all the time, like a camera. But I find if you just explain something out loud, you're so much more likely to understand it. And also sometimes you might just be talking and then you realise, oh, actually, I don't quite understand that, or there's gaps, you don't quite know what to say. And that's when you know that, oh, okay, maybe I need to go over that area a little bit more. Like, I used to just talk to my sister about all random things. Bless her, she just got me talking about all sorts. But we'd just be on the way to school, and I'd try and simplify what I'd been learning so that she would understand it. And by doing that, I would either work out that I did understand it, or I really had no clue what I was talking about either. It's definitely a good way to prove your understanding. It might feel a little bit weird at first, especially if you aren't actually talking to a person and you're just talking out loud. But sometimes saying it out loud rather than just reading things over and over in your head is so much more useful. You can also record yourself saying the information out loud, even if you're not just kind of saying it from memory. If you want to read it straight from your notes or straight from your flashcards, but record it and then play it back to yourself, you can then listen to that whilst you're out on a walk, whilst you're on the way to school, almost like a podcast, but you've made the podcast tailored to what you need to go over. Because then again, you're constantly exposed to the content. You're constantly familiarizing yourself with it. Okay, next is mind maps. Mind maps can look really different for different people. Some people load their mind maps up with content. Like there is not one bit of plain paper left. They are packed. And then other people prefer to have really simple mind maps, just showing connections between different topics or diagrams. But whatever you choose to do, it's a great way to see how previous content links to the content you're currently learning. And especially for subjects where there's lots and lots of content, seeing it laid out in sort of like a spider diagram format where you can see how all of the different little bits link to each other makes it so much less overwhelming than just seeing like a whole page of writing. Okay, and my very final point for today that I want to talk about, which I think is the most important thing for you to do, is past paper questions. Because it's all good and well that you can understand and remember the content, but if you don't know how to apply it in the exam, then it's pointless. Sometimes exam boards can be really picky with exam technique and the way that you answer a question. And if you don't wrap your head around that before the exam, you could know all of the content but not know how to correctly answer the question. And then you're losing marks, even though you would have got full marks because you knew the content, you just didn't know how to accurately use it in the question. You can find plenty of past paper questions online, and then afterwards you can use the mark schemes and the examiner reports, which can be found on the websites for your different exam boards. But completing and marking your own questions is a great way to get used to exam technique and also identify gaps in your knowledge as well, because you can see which things you keep missing out or forgetting. Okay, and I think that's all of the revision techniques I want to talk about today. If I've missed any out that you think are important, make sure to leave them in the comments. Also, I'm really interested to know, how do you revise? I know different things work for different people. I quite like doing notes first and then flashcards and mind maps afterwards and then past paper questions. But I'm kind of curious, what works for everybody else? If you did like this video, please make sure to like, subscribe, comment down below if you haven't already, and turn on post notifications so you're notified every single time I post a new video. Thank you so much for watching. Good luck with your exams. Make sure to take care of yourself, don't work too hard, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!